Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to invite you all to this second event in the EPC's brand new series, EPC Talks Geopolitics. Our guest today really needs no introduction. He is a well-known face in Europe and well beyond. So a very warm welcome to Alexander Stubb. Dr. Stubb is the director of the School for Transnational Governance at the EUI in Florence. He is also chairman of Crisis Management Initiative. He has also previously been Finnish Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Finance Minister, as well as a member of the European Parliament and Vice President of the EIB. He has a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics. At the EPC, we are also delighted that he recently became a member of our governing board. We are going to start this 45-minute discussion with me putting a few questions to Dr. Stubb before turning the floor to you, the audience. I would really appreciate it if you could already start putting your questions right from the beginning into the question and answer box. I would also encourage you to use the microphone icon to give your questions physically. I mean, from my side or from our side, it's always very nice to hear other voices, people in the audience, rather than just sort of being in this sort of just the two of us. So I want to start already by putting the first question to Dr. Stubb, and I want to start with COVID related issues. And I would like to ask you, how would you evaluate the situation now in the EU regarding the pandemic, and particularly the rollout of the vaccines?
Well, thanks a lot, Amanda, and thanks for having me. And you know, I'm just an informal Scandi, so none of this Dr. Stubb stuff. Just Alex is fine. I'm sure we'll be all right with that. The pandemic is always a classic way to start, I guess, nowadays. And you know, my take is very simple on this. All political leaders at the moment are thinking about three things related to the pandemic. Number one is number of fatalities. Number two is rollout of the vaccine. And number three is the bounce back of the economy. These are the three basic criteria that I think all leaders will be facing on Judgment Day. And of course, we're seeing right now the ones who had a lot of dead in the beginning, they're forgetting that and focusing on the vaccines. The ones who are doing well in the vaccines, the focus is only there. And the ones who might see a bounce back if the economy is saying, look, we were able to deal with this glitch. From a European perspective, I'm much more optimistic than a lot of the black sort of, how do I say, public discourse that we're seeing. I actually think that the European Union, namely the European Commission, has dealt with this pandemic very well. It was very quick in reacting in the early phases last year. Secondly, it was able to muster, I think, one of the biggest stimulation packages that we've seen in recent history, I think rather successfully. And if you take that combined with the ECB's PEP program, with the EIB, with the ESM, and with the Commission's trust program, I think they did quite well. On top of that, the Commission did a really good job, I think, or fairly good job of negotiating procurement for vaccines. There isn't that much you can do if, you know, AstraZeneca sort of screws it up. But you know, all in all, I hate to say this, but you know, I think this is probably the best crisis that the European Union has been in recent memory.
So does that mean if you were still in office, you wouldn't have done anything differently? You would have followed the same lines as the EU and your government, and particularly in Finland, or would you have done something differently?
Okay, first caveat here, I ain't going to be commenting about anything related to Finland or the current government. I think there's nothing worse than a former prime minister giving advice to current leaders. It's a tough enough job. Just stay out of it and do your own thing. It's very easy to say that I would have done this and that differently. But the truth is that when you're in the middle of a crisis, it's very, important to try to find different solutions. I think all in all, I would not have done much differently. If there would be one thing that I would have perhaps done slightly differently from a European, I'm talking EU perspective, is communication. I think the European Union and the European Commission has not been robust enough in communicating the successes of dealing with the pandemic. As I said, success number one was to stop this knee-jerk reaction of the member states to close borders and stop the free movement of goods, services, and people. Number two was putting together a colossal rescue package, which at the end of the day kept the European markets calm and hopefully will reignite, if done correctly by the member states, the European economies. Thirdly, they did a good job in the vaccine procurement. And finally, may I say, this is about soft power. The EU is the #1 exporter of vaccines, over 130 million doses to over 80 countries globally. And this stuff needs to be communicated. So would I have done anything differently? I would have tried to communicate it a bit better. Would I have succeeded? I have no clue. But as I said, this has got nothing to do with Finland. Let the current prime minister and her government do their own thing.
Thank you. That's a very diplomatic response. I would like to now turn back to the issue of reopening the economy, which is obviously the crucial thing now. I mean, how do you think this should be done? Does Europe need to make a sort of big calculated risk and just quickly open it to get the economy bounced back, or should it be done, let's say, more slowly?
Well, it's a combination of things. I must say that I'm especially attached to the phrase that you used as well, which Mario Draghi has coined. I'm not talking about whatever it takes here. I'm talking about the notion of a calculated risk. And I think that's what we're looking at the moment. And I think the key word here is open. So yes, I would start opening up the economies. I would stick to the basic tenets that have been the success of generating growth in Europe. In other words, the free movement of goods, services, people, and money. I would be very hesitant to have any type of protectionist measures. Now, when we do this calculated risk, we have to, of course, take into consideration also health as part of the risk domain here. Now, it doesn't really matter that much in the free movement of goods and services, but it does matter in the free movement of people. So therefore, I would be supporting all kinds of measures, which first of all, get the vaccine rollout as soon as possible. Secondly, have common standards in terms of safety measures and well, being careful. And then finally, also anything which indicates or goes in the direction of I think what the Greek prime minister originally suggested, Mitsotakis, about a vaccine passport, because that sort of alleviates and helps out things. So yeah, I think open is the key here, and open in all kinds of directions. Otherwise, we won't get the economies going. This combined with the stimulation package that is being rolled out and right now proposed by various member states, I think will be enough. So stimulate and open, I think that's the key.
But if it's not done in the right way, is there a possibility of having a political and social backlash? Is this not a risk, and how could it be avoided? I mean, many citizens, let's say, are feeling very unhappy about their current personal circumstances, and obviously want their economic and social situations to improve rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, but remember that the virus mutates, and so does the pandemic. So I've said from the beginning that what we're going to see are different sort of mutations of the implications of the pandemic. Some of them are political. There are going to be governments that will be toppled. Some of them are going to be obviously economic, as we have seen early on in the pandemic. Some of them are going to be health related. So there are going to be many different perspectives on this. So yes, there are going to be political and social ramifications. That's in the nature of things. In terms of discontent, I think it's quite natural for us human beings to be less content when our freedoms are restricted and limited. And no one, not one government is going to get this pitch perfect and right. So there is going to be a lot of disgruntled people, but that's why I'm saying that at some stage you have to, weigh the balance between the risks in health versus the economic risks, which both have ramifications in the social perspective and the personal perspective. So you just have to have the courage to start opening up. And then if that doesn't work, you have to have the courage to lock down. I think what we need are slightly more clear mechanisms. I mean, for instance, here in Italy, I'm very pleased with the way in which things have been done. You have this sort of color system of yellow, orange, and red, if you will. And because Italy was struck so hard in the beginning of the pandemic, they had automaticity between infection rates and colors in the different regions. So you knew exactly what was going to happen. So when it goes red, it's pretty much a lockdown. When it's orange, there's partial opening. And when it's yellow, we're starting to go back to normal. And I think these kinds of mechanisms are quite good to have. But to answer you briefly, yes, there's going to be social unrest. Yes, there's going to be political turbulence. And yes, economically, this is going to be difficult. It's in the nature of any pandemic.
And also this topic of COVID passports, this is also proving to be, quite controversial. I think the European Parliament is due to vote on it. There seems to be quite a lot of opposition to it. I mean, it's seen as could be discriminatory against those who haven't been vaccinated. I mean, what's your view on this? Do you see it as something that we should have, or there should be another way around this?
Yeah, short answer is that I do think it's something we should have. At the same time, I do realize that you can look at this from two perspectives, which could be considered rather problematic. One of them is a privacy issue, because we are talking about health. We're talking about basically the core of who you and I are as human beings. And the question is, do I seriously want to share whether I've been vaccinated or not, et cetera, et cetera. The second aspect of this is what could be called equality or justice or discriminatory aspect. Now here, I fall into the category that if you have been vaccinated and therefore you will be allowed to go to a concert, go to a pub, or to travel, it is not away from me. I do think if we look at and consider that all things are equal in Europe, in other words, that the order of vaccination is equal in terms of higher risk groups going first and then coming down, then I think we should appreciate the fact and open up to the fact that, by the end of the summer, we'll have herd immunity and 70% of the people vaccinated. So why not allow those people who have the vaccination to enjoy the services and the freedom that we used to have? So I have a very hard time buying the argument that this is a completely discriminatory measure. We can't be in a society where everyone gets everything at the same time, and if they don't, then we close up. So the choice here is between basically lockdown or open up, and I'm definitely for vaccine passport and opening up.
One last COVID-related question before I move on to some foreign policy issues. I mean, how do you see the future of work? I mean, obviously, the whole world has changed the way that it works because of the pandemic. Is this something that you see is likely to continue, or will there be sort of something in between?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's going to continue, and it of course depends on the trade that you're in. I mean, you and I are what I would call information managers. So basically, most of the day we sit in front of a screen and put together numbers and letters and express those either in writing, in speech, or right now as we're doing in video. In other words, we use our brain to project some kind of ideas. Now, the big question here is that, are we more efficient working like this or not? And I would argue, well, partially, yes, we are. Say, for instance, one day I do recall I had 8 Zoom meetings on 5 different continents. And in other words, 8 different countries. Would I have ever been able to do that if I was traveling physically? Well, no, I would not, unless, of course, I was beamed from one place to another, but we're not that far with technology yet. I've also read some interesting studies. I think McKinsey had 15 different ramifications of this sort of online world that we're living in. And one of the things I remember from that one is that in terms of teleworking, or whatever we want to call it, I think when you start pushing north of 75% staying at home and working on a screen, that's when productivity starts going out. So at the end of the day, I'm sure we will find a balance. I find it quite exciting, actually, that modern work, in the type of work that you and I do, is actually now independent of geography. So I am sitting in my flat. The room was in Florence. The room was built in 1450. And I'm sitting talking to you on a screen with X amount of people around the world listening to it when you are actually in Brussels. I'm also stressing this a lot, here at the European University Institute, our School of Transnational Governance. We're moving down to downtown Florence. And I want to create a completely new, modern type of a working environment. And the message that I have to our team is to say that, listen, you basically have 2 or 3 different locations where you can work from. One is Buontalenti, our new headquarters. One is up in our campus in Badia, in Fiesole. And one is from home or cafe or wherever you feel like working from. At the same time, I do feel that, people like me, you and I, we yearn for the human contact. So there's only that much you can do virtually. It's cool that I can do this. And I must admit that I'm very lucky because I'm of a generation where I've already done my basic networking. It's much tougher, and so are you. So it's much tougher for, young professionals now to try to, network through the virtual world. So, we'll find a balance. Final point, I think we'll probably reduce work-related travel a little bit, or quite a lot. But I'm not sure we're going to reduce tourist-related traveling at all. That'll be back.
Well, I think a lot of people have missed work-related travel as well. I know I certainly have. Not being able to go to the Caucasus and Ukraine and Russia. So I've definitely missed that, and I'll be happy to get that back to normal. Before I move on to the next part, I just want to take a couple of questions.
No, I can tell you that I used to travel. I had about 120 flights a year. And I can tell you that about 100 of them, I ain't missing at all. 20 I can do with.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions we have from the floor. The first from John Palmer. If you would unmute him, please, Nat.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Alex. Nice to see you. After all the years when I remember you in your pre-stellar political career days doing projects with the European Policy Centre. I've got a couple of questions which have in common the potential progress which might be made in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which hopefully will begin later this year. The first arises from health. Surely some of the lessons we've learned from the problems, the mistakes, as well as the achievements of the pandemic suggest that there should be some stronger initiative function for the Union in confronting problems as complex as the ones we've just been through, where the bargaining position of individual member states in a very tough world of purchasing drugs is all very different. The second question is, in talking about the future of our economy and our society, peace and stability remain crucial. What would you like to see happen in terms of the relationship between the European Union and the applicant member states in the Balkans? I'm thinking of Albania, North Macedonia, etc. We can't surely keep them dangling on the end of a string for long. So two different issues, but I'd be very interested in your opinion on both.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. Nice to, well, not see you, but hear you. Because the video wasn't on, and I do fondly remember the 1990s when we were struggling around with the Amsterdam negotiations and Nice negotiations, and then early 2000 with the convention, other interesting institutional issues. I'm actually quite excited about the conference on the future of Europe. At the same time, from my experience, having negotiated all the treaties after Maastricht and all the institutional caveats after that, and being involved in the reflection group of Amsterdam, and then a little bit looking at the wise men's group preparing the convention. I'm also realistic of what can be achieved in the conference of Europe. I think it's in and of itself important that we have a process and a discussion, and I'm of course a little bit saddened of the way in which it was sort of set up institutionally and how long it took, but you know, that shouldn't take away the virtue of the conversation. Now, on the particular health question, I fully agree with you. I think, you know, we should be moving, if I can give a catchword, towards some kind of a health union. This doesn't mean that the European Union takes responsibility of the basic health care of member states. It's more the top-down dealing with global pandemics. And I do think, you know, if the pandemic taught us one thing, it did many, but one of them had to do with value chains and the fact that, you know, globalists like myself were perhaps a little bit too optimistic, even at times naive, about where different products should and could be produced and how easily, you know, whether it's vaccines, whether it's masks, whatever it's related here. I think, you know, if we don't learn a lesson from this one, also to understand that it's better to have something like the European Commission negotiating vaccine procurement for us, I think then we haven't learned much. On enlargement, which is of course a completely different question, as you mentioned, you know, I've always been pro-enlargement. I actually think it's one of the best policies that the European Union has ever had. It has this appeal, soft power to bring in countries to its system. And I do think that, you know, the step-by-step process of integrating the Western Balkans into the European Union is welcome. It shows to a certain extent the robustness, resilience, and strength of the whole system. And may I add that I do hope that one day we'll also get the United Kingdom back, and I'm sure that will happen as well.
Staying on the enlargement topic, Turkey is still a candidate country, you know, despite all the problems that we have. Do you believe, I mean, as you've just said, you still believe in enlargement, that if Turkey was to meet all the criteria, it should still be allowed to join the EU? Or is it something that is never going to happen?
Well, I mean, you know, if the European Union is serious about rule of law, and if your caveat and qualification for the question is if it meets all the criteria, then, you know, we have to stand true to our institutional commitments, our contractual arrangements. And I've always been, you know, pro-enlargement with Turkey as well. Having said that, you know, with the current government and with the current behavior of President Erdogan or Prime Minister Erdogan, no chance. You know, you can't take into the European Union someone who is basically, you know, unfortunately behaving like a authoritarian leader. We are about liberal democracy. We're not about authoritarian democracy. So Turkey simply does not meet the accession criteria at the moment. Whether it then does this in 5, 10, 15 or 20 years is a completely different story. But a lot of things will have to change before Turkey can become a member of the European Union. And mind you, I was at the European Council as a young civil servant in Helsinki in December 1999, when then President Ecevit came and basically signed the opening of the door for accession negotiations. So, you know, we've come a long way, but I still think we have a long way, unfortunately.
Yeah, very unfortunately. Staying on the foreign policy, Chancellor Merkel will be leaving later this year. What impact do you think this will have on EU foreign policy? And if I can just add link to that, you're the head of, Crisis Management Initiative, a conflict and peace building organization. And I've seen you quoted as saying, all problems and conflicts can be resolved. How do you think the EU could best tackle Russia and resolve its problems with Russia? Or how do you see the EU's current approach? Is it the right one, or could things be done slightly different? I mean, given all the problems that we have with Russia and the latest developments that we know very well, what's your view on this?
Okay, so two small questions, one Merkel, the other one peace and Russia. Okay, on Merkel, I mean, Chancellor Merkel, I should, qualify and make a caveat here. I'm a huge fan. I mean, we sat next to each other in the European Council, and, if I were to name the top three, one of the top three leaders of the world that I've met over the years, and there are hundreds of them, Angela Merkel would definitely be one of them. She's one of these rare people who can master both the minute detail of drafting, for instance, council conclusions, and at the same time be able to express herself on the big picture. She's calm, cool, and collected in virtually any situation and crisis that I've seen her in. This as a caveat, it obviously follows that there'll be a huge lacuna in European leadership, and therefore also instability and personality when the Chancellor leaves. She would, however, be the first one to say that, listen, people grow into these positions. She would probably say, look at me when I started. No one expected me to succeed. So I am sure that, someone else from somewhere at some stage will emerge, not as a new Merkel, but as a leader with a different type of an approach. And I like the way in which, German foreign policy has been quite, how would I say, at the center of European foreign policy and fairly calm, I think, over the years. Now, your follow-up question, actually, the CMI has just changed its name. We're called CMI, the Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, because of course we were founded 20 years ago by Nobel Peace Laureate President Martti Ahtisaari. And we're now a big peace mediation organization with roughly 100 people working for us. The question of Russia is always interesting, especially for someone who comes from a country which has 1,300 kilometers of common border. Are we dealing with it in the correct way? I don't think there's one correct way to deal with Russia. I belong to the people who rather idealistically believe that Russia would integrate itself into the international community. And I think it was looking, albeit a bit hectic, but fairly good in the 1990s. But 2000, and especially I think from the Munich conference 2007 onwards, we have gone from bad to worse. I think the war in Georgia was the beginning of it, continued, of course, thereafter with the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine. There's this sense of intimidation, and probably the only neighbor that Russia doesn't treat harshly is Finland, for one reason or another. But everyone else, it doesn't like to see stable democracies around it, which I, of course, find quite sad. With what Russia did in the Crimean Peninsula, basically annexing the territory from another country against international law is something that you can't overlook. And therefore, if and when the key instrument of European foreign policy is sanctions, it was the right thing to do. And before that situation is somehow solved, I have no idea how it's going to be done. I think it's very difficult to change tack. I think what usually happens is that if you modernize your economy, you start becoming more and more a developed country and can start moving towards more traditional liberal democracy. Russia is not doing that. Over 50% of its state income is still coming from traditional raw materials such as oil and natural gas. And we know that that is not the future of economic generation nor energy. So I'm not very hopeful about the way in which Russia is developing at the moment. And this is not to say anything negative about Russia or Russians. Quite the contrary. Believe me, I am the first person who wants to see a successful Russia. But right now, the way in which things are going, I don't see much change in the near future.
But just to continue on this issue, I mean, the EU is frequently, accused of not speaking with one voice on Russia, not coming up with, robust enough responses to some of Russia's actions. I mean, the most recent ones, the military build-up on the border with Ukraine, and the developments in vis-a-vis the Czech Republic. I mean, there's often, let's say, a very slow or a very unclear response. I mean, do you think that the EU member states should make more of an effort to try and speak with one voice as a way to sort of push back against Russia's disruptive approach?
Well, it's easier said than done. I mean, everyone who criticizes the European Union for lack of one voice or criticizes for being too soft on Russia. How do you create one voice out of 27? And what would you do differently? What, attack Russia? Probably not. So, I think from the Finnish experience, what you need with Russia is a certain level of respect. So, you cannot show any kind of weakness. And that means that, when push comes to shove, you have to use tough language. I mean, that's always a good starting point. And Russia, to a certain extent, respects that. When you do that, you shouldn't also undervalue or undermine Russia or Russianness. And the question is of finding this balance. And of course, historically, we have countries who've had different experiences with Russia, some good, most bad. And that also, determines probably the level of the language that you want to use with Russia. And, I'll give it for another example is I think Russia has now sort of defined or highlighted 9 hostile countries. And if the 3 Baltic states there, I mean, of course, they're going to react toughly and they're right to do so. There's no question about that. But I think the key instrument that we have is still sanctions and diplomacy. So, be tough with the sanctions, keep the channels of conversation open, and then take it from there. But, softness is something that Russians, should not be showed or seen. On the one voice thing, I mean, come on. I'll be very frank with this. It's great that we have an external action service. It's great that we have a high representative. It's great that we have a European president of the Commission and a president of the European Council. It is impossible for all of these to defend one European line because the member states want to show their muscle in foreign policy as well. So let's be more realistic about what we can do and what we can say. And I think for all intents and purposes, European foreign policy is perhaps underperforming at the moment, but it's not as bad as people often say that it is.
Thank you. Now I'm going to move on from Russia and foreign policy, as I have a couple of questions here related to the famous, Sofagate, and they're asking how damaging was Sofagate to the EU, and what changes could be made to the EU structures following this.
Okay, let me look at the silver lining here, and I guess to a certain extent try to address an important and serious issue, which has been, how would I say, quite actively discussed in the Brussels bubble and elsewhere over the past few weeks. Okay, here's the silver lining. I think the good thing with Sofagate was that we were able to begin a conversation about European foreign policy representation. How many people are now more aware of the fact that we have a president of the European Commission and a president of the European Council, and that they actually have a foreign policy voice? So this was not necessarily a nice way of bringing it forward, because it didn't look good, it wasn't right, it played to the wrong hands. But at the same time, now we can start this conversation. It's not an easy one, because of course we have a dual executive, the European Commission and the Council, in this particular case, through the European Council. You know, it's a little bit like having, you know, a president and a prime minister with different types of tasks. And this sort of juggling of roles is not going to be easy. Now, in Turkey, my take is quite simple. Accession, in whose hands is that? The European Commission. Customs union, who has exclusive competence on that? The European Commission. And of course, trade, who has exclusive competence on that? The European Commission. So it didn't look good, but I always want to look at the silver lining and say that it brought to a fore an issue which needs to be addressed. Protocol does matter symbolically, and I must say that from a European perspective, this didn't look good, but I do hope that we can find a solution in the long run. I'm not excessively worried about the situation.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Philip Hamro-Drotz, who's had his hand up for a while. So if you could unmute him, please, Nat. Hello. Philip, are you there?
Philip, you have to unmute
okay,
yourself.
We seem to be having some...
There we are. Here we go. You hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Hello here from Finland. Also very happy to have the opportunity to have a chat with Alexander Stubb. Well, as I'm coming from the northernmost EU member state, I would like to draw the attention to some specifics up in the north. The first one is the high north, that is to say the Arctic region, but also the Baltic Sea region. In both regions, we know that there are emerging interests globally, but also both regions are they have very scarce environment. So, but the point is that it is geologically of importance due to the climate also. Well, that is to say, economics up in the north, yes, we trade, we transport with big major players globally, that is to say China, United States, Russia, and so on. And then in the Baltic Sea region, we have also all these countries, including Russia. In both regions, we have some joint arenas, Council of Baltic Sea States, the Arctic Council, the Barents Council.
Philip, I think you need to move
Question
to
is
your
that-
question, man.
Yes. So my
Can you
question
finish
is,
your question?
what is your view about the development and the situation in these regions? And do you think that the European Union would have a better role to play up here? Thank you.
No, thanks for the question and the introduction. I mean, I'm always a little bit hesitant to go for dividing lines, whether they are north-south or east-west, because they simplify things a little bit too much. So on the north-south divide, it was very much an issue during the financial crisis and the Euro crisis. The east-west divide was very much an issue during the migration crisis. And now that we're in the middle of a pandemic, I kind of want to look at the global package and think that we can start mentally distinguishing between these so-called geographic differences. But for those people who don't necessarily follow the North, I mean, there are security issues there. And needless to say, you know, they surround the Baltic Sea, and they are related to the action and reaction of the Russian Federation. But at the same time, you know, I don't think, for, you know, this whole debate, for instance, that in the northern country, I mean, I have a very hard time understanding those people who are trying to think about the pandemic, for instance, and the post-pandemic era as a north-south divide. And I think we need to steer away from that and think about this crisis as a different crisis. But yeah, so the issues in, you know, in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, out of the EU countries, are not that radically different from the issues that are being grappled with in, say, Greece, Italy, where I am at the moment, and in Spain. Similar issues, similar problems. We're in this boat together is my answer to that.
I have time for one last question here. So I'd like to ask you to comment on the transatlantic relationship. Would you say that now that Biden is, you know, it is, let's say, past 100 days, on relations sort of fully restored, would be my question. And Adam Isaacs in the audience has asked a question: how should the EU brace itself for disappointment after a couple of years of the Biden administration? Obviously, he's not very positively disposed.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, obviously we have to understand that the transatlantic relationship is different from what it was in the beginning of 2016. And that is mainly because we live in a different world. I personally think that the tectonic plates of foreign policy are changing, and we're seeing the emergence of three basic power blocks: China, the United States, and the European Union, if it plays its cards right. There was obviously a lot of damage done to the transatlantic relationship during the Trump presidency. But at the same time, I think a lot of people on the European side of the fence are very pleased with the way in which the Biden administration has kicked off, not least joining the climate accord, back to the WHO, a strong focus on multilateralism, back to a strong commitment to NATO, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this is, you know, both symbolic and then done in deed, whether it's in terms of presence or visits or language used. And of course, you know, Biden's speech yesterday was a little bit more on the sort of domestic policy side, as State of the Union addresses often are. But there is this positive undercurrent about a more traditional transatlantic relationship, which I am quite pleased about. Having said that, I do think it's going to take time. I think Adam Isaac's question was taking us to a certain direction. I don't necessarily agree that we're going to be disappointed, but what we should do is probably keep the expectations low, then the outcome will be high. I think it'll be tough for Europe to navigate on issues such as Iran, Russia, and China, together with the United States. So had Trump remained in office, there would have been more, if I may use a term that's often used, strategic autonomy to do what we want. But now with our rebirth, remarriage of the transatlantic relationship, I think we're more tied to the hip of American foreign policy, which in some occasions is not necessarily a bad thing. But let me tell you, Amanda, and I'll finish off with this. I am so pleased that I don't have to wake up in the morning and the first thing I open on Twitter is some kind of a scream and shout from Trump. And the first thing when I open the Financial Times or read Political, the New York Times or BBC or whatever it might be, Le Figaro, the first thing I see is the face of Donald Trump. I think the world is a hell of a lot of better place without Donald Trump. But the big question is not in 2 years, The big question is in 4 years, who will be the footnote in history, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And I certainly hope that it will be Donald Trump.
Yes, so do I, and I guess so does most of other people watching this conversation as well. And on that note, unfortunately, we have to draw this conversation to an end. I would like to thank you very much, Alex, for sparing the time this morning and joining us in this interesting conversation where you covered, you know, I have to say, really a lot of issues from every angle. So thank you for doing that. We look forward to continuing, you know, our cooperation, particularly now you're a member of our governing board. Thanks to the audience for joining us. I would like to flag up as well that this series will continue with gusto. On the 6th of May, we will be welcoming the Romanian foreign minister, who will be having a conversation about the Black Sea and Black Sea security. So you should be receiving that invitation too, so please do come. Once again, Alex, thanks very much. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and a wonderful weekend.
Thank
Thanks
you
a lot. All the best.
From the audience also. Thank you very much, and all the best to you, Alexander, and to Amanda. Thanks. Bye.